The courtroom was filled with an air of tension. The sound of murmurs and shuffling papers could be heard as everyone waited for the judge to arrive. People glanced at the young teenager sitting nervously in the defendant's seat, trying their best to ignore his presence. He didn't seem like he belonged there. Alex, only 16 years old, looked like he had wandered into the wrong place by accident. His clothes were mismatched, and his hair, a bit messy, fell over his eyes. His hands were shaking slightly as they rested on the wooden table in front of him. There was no doubt that he was the youngest person in the courtroom. The judge, a stern man in his 50s with a graying beard, walked in and took his seat at the bench. His face showed no emotion, just the usual seriousness that came with his position. The people in the room fell silent. The case at hand was simple. The prosecutor was confident. He had all the evidence in place, and the defendant, this teenage boy, didn't stand a chance. The judge looked down at his papers, prepared to hear what he thought would be an easy case. He wasn't expecting much from Alex. After all, what did a teenager know about law? "Call the defendant to the stand," the judge commanded, his voice booming in the otherwise quiet courtroom. Alex slowly stood up, his knees a little unsteady, and walked up to the podium. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced, but he tried to keep his composure. He could hear the whispering in the background. People were clearly surprised that a teenager had the nerve to defend himself in such a serious case. The judge, who had already decided in his mind that this was going to be a short session, raised an eyebrow as Alex stood before him. "You're here to defend yourself?" the judge asked with a sarcastic tone, not even attempting to hide his disbelief. As the trial continued, the tension in the courtroom began to shift. Alex had already surprised everyone by pointing out mistakes in the prosecution's case, but now it was time for him to dig deeper, to prove that he wasn't just a clueless teenager trying to get by. He had to show that he could really handle this. The eyes of everyone in the room were now fixed on him, some with doubt, others with curiosity. It felt like the entire courtroom was holding its breath, waiting for Alex to either stumble or rise to the challenge. The recess. The tension in the courtroom was almost tangible. The prosecutor, still visibly frustrated, sat stiffly at his desk, while Alex stood tall at the podium, his focus unwavering. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. The courtroom was in chaos. The judge's gavel had barely come down before the murmurs started to fill the air. Alex stood quietly by the podium, his heart still racing as he absorbed what had just happened. He had done it. He had actually won. The case, the challenge, the courtroom full of experienced professionals, he had faced them all and come out victorious. It was surreal. For a moment, he felt like he was floating, like it wasn't even real. The prosecutor, who had once been so sure of himself, was now standing there, visibly stunned, his face flushed red. He seemed unable to form words, his jaw working silently as he stared at the judge. The room was filled with shocked whispers, some in disbelief, others in admiration. People were talking about the teenager who had just done what most adults would never have dared to try, let alone succeed at. Alex felt a hand on his shoulder, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was the defendant, the man Alex had been defending, who now stood beside him with a wide grin. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude and awe. "I can't believe you did it. You saved me." Alex smiled, nodding, though his mind was still processing everything that had happened. "You did nothing wrong," he said simply. "You deserved to be heard. The truth deserved to come out." He was still trying to fully comprehend the weight of what had just occurred. This wasn't just a victory for the defendant, it was a personal victory for Alex too. He had proven that he belonged in the courtroom, that his age didn't define his ability to understand the law or fight for justice. As the courtroom began to empty, people started coming up to congratulate him. Some were attorneys, others were members of the jury, and there were even a few reporters. They all wanted to know the same thing: how had a teenager managed to win a case against such an experienced prosecutor? How had Alex been able to catch the flaws in the prosecution's arguments that no one else had noticed? Alex smiled but didn't offer too much in response. He wasn't looking for fame or praise. What mattered to him was that he had done what he set out to do. He had used his knowledge of the law, his determination, and his sharp mind to expose the truth. And in doing so, he had proved something far greater than winning a case. He had shown that anyone, no matter their age, could stand up for what's right and make a difference. The judge, who had remained seated behind the bench after the verdict, now stood up, signaling that the court session was officially over. His eyes met Alex's across the room, and for a moment, there was silence between them. Then, the judge gave a small nod of acknowledgement, his expression softening. "Young man," the judge called out, his voice carrying through the still courtroom, "you've made a strong case. Your argument was solid, and your understanding of the law, impressive. I may have doubted you in the beginning, but I can't deny that you've earned my respect today. You've shown that intelligence and integrity are what truly matter in this courtroom, not the years on a person's birth certificate." The words hung in the air, and Alex felt a mix of pride and disbelief. He had earned the respect of the judge, someone who had seen countless attorneys walk through the doors of the courtroom. The realization hit him: he wasn't just a teenager playing lawyer. He was someone who could stand tall and be taken seriously. He had proven that age was just a number, and knowledge, passion, and determination were what truly made a person powerful. The prosecutor, who had spent the entire trial dismissing Alex's abilities, now walked past him, his shoulders slumped, his head low. Alex could see the look of defeat on his face. The prosecutor didn't say anything to Alex, but he didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. Alex turned to the defendant, who was still grinning ear to ear. "I told you it wasn't just about you," Alex said with a quiet chuckle. "It was about standing up for what's right." The defendant laughed and clapped him on the back. "You certainly stood up for me, and I'll never forget that. You're going to be a great lawyer one day, Alex. I can see it." Alex felt a warmth spread through him at the compliment, but he didn't let it show too much. He had no plans of becoming a lawyer, at least not in the traditional sense. For now, his journey was about proving to himself that he could do anything, that no challenge was too great if you had the right mindset. As the courtroom started to clear out, Alex felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see a reporter from a local news outlet standing there, her pen and notepad ready. "Excuse me, Alex," she said with a smile. "Do you mind if I ask you a few questions? The people in the courtroom are all talking about you. It's not every day that a teenager wins a case like this." Alex hesitated for a moment. He wasn't one for the spotlight. He hadn't done this for the attention, but for the principle of justice. Still, he nodded, agreeing to answer a few questions. The reporter's first question was straightforward. "What made you decide to take on this case, Alex? Were you nervous?" He smiled, though it was more of a soft, thoughtful smile than one of pride. "I wasn't nervous about the case itself," he said. "I was nervous about whether people would take me seriously. But once I started looking at the evidence, I knew what had to be done. It wasn't about age or experience, it was about understanding the facts and standing up for what's right." The reporter scribbled down his words, her eyes wide with admiration. "You certainly did stand up for what's right today, Alex. You've shown that you don't need a law degree to make a difference." Alex's heart swelled with a quiet satisfaction. He wasn't looking for accolades, but if his actions could inspire someone else to take a stand, then it had all been worth it. As the reporter thanked him and walked away, Alex turned back to the defendant, who was still shaking his head in disbelief. "You did it," the man said again. "You really did it." Alex nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. It wasn't just the courtroom victory that mattered, but the journey he had taken. He had faced doubt, ridicule, and uncertainty, but he had never backed down. And now, as he stood in the very same courtroom where just hours before people had written him off, he knew that he had made a real difference. Not just for the defendant, but for himself, and perhaps for anyone who had ever doubted what someone his age could accomplish. With a final glance at the empty courtroom, Alex walked out into the world beyond, his mind already racing with new possibilities, new challenges, and the unwavering belief that he could accomplish anything. With skepticism, others with growing respect, but he knew that the hardest part was still ahead. The moment he'd been waiting for had arrived. Now, it was time to reveal the truth. Alex had already proven that he was capable of handling the case with a depth of understanding that no one had expected from him. He had challenged the prosecution at every turn, using facts and logic that left the prosecutor scrambling for answers. The judge, once doubtful, was now listening carefully to every word Alex said. The courtroom was quieter now than it had been at the beginning of the trial. It was as though the entire room was waiting for Alex to make his final move. The prosecutor, who had hoped to wear Alex down with his interruptions, had been forced to sit back and watch as the young defendant dismantled his case piece by piece. The judge, though he hadn't made any final statements yet, had shown signs of a shift in his attitude. It was clear that he was starting to see Alex not as a clueless teenager, but as someone who understood the intricacies of the law far better than anyone had assumed. Alex stood still for a moment, making sure he had everyone's attention. He looked at the judge, meeting his gaze with confidence. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady but filled with purpose, "I've spent the last few days going over every single detail of this case. I've examined the evidence, I've spoken with experts, and I've cross-referenced the statements. I can confidently say that the prosecution's case is built on assumptions and faulty evidence. The facts do not add up." He paused, letting his words hang in the air for a moment. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Alex didn't falter. He continued, "The key to this case is the defendant's whereabouts at the time of the alleged crime. The prosecution claims that he was in one place, but the evidence shows that he was somewhere else. The timeline does not match. The forensic evidence does not match. The witness testimonies do not match." The prosecutor stood up, trying to interrupt, but the judge raised a hand, signaling him to remain seated. For the first time in this trial, the prosecutor seemed genuinely at a loss for words. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a sense of frustration that he couldn't hide. Alex continued, "We all know that in a case like this, the burden of proof falls on the prosecution. They must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed the crime. But what we have here is nothing but circumstantial evidence, with no direct connection to the defendant. No clear motive, no solid proof. Just assumptions." The room was silent, everyone listening closely to Alex's words. The judge's expression had shifted from one of skepticism to one of deep thought. He was no longer simply going through the motions of the trial. He was considering the case with the seriousness it deserved. Alex could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it. This was the moment he had been preparing for. He had studied the law for months, gone over the evidence countless times, and now he was finally in a position to make his argument. He wasn't just defending the defendant anymore. He was defending the truth. "Your Honor," Alex said, his voice calm but firm, "I would like to submit the final piece of evidence for your consideration. I've spoken with several forensic experts, and their findings were clear. The prosecution's interpretation of the evidence is flawed. The defendant could not have been at the scene at the time they claim. There is no way he could have committed the crime." The judge, who had been quietly observing Alex, looked down at the pile of evidence in front of him. He seemed to be weighing Alex's words carefully. "And you're certain about this?" the judge asked, his voice low. Alex nodded, his expression serious. "Yes, Your Honor. The evidence is clear. The timeline, the forensic reports, the witness statements, all of them point to the defendant's innocence. And with that, I ask that you dismiss all charges against him." There was a moment of silence in the courtroom as the judge absorbed everything Alex had just said. The prosecutor opened his mouth, as if to argue, but closed it again, realizing that he had no solid ground to stand on. The judge looked up from the evidence, his gaze fixed on Alex. For the first time, he looked at the young man with respect. "You've made your case, mister," the judge began, but his words were cut off by the prosecutor standing up quickly. "Your Honor," the prosecutor interrupted, his voice rising again. "This is absurd. The defense is making wild claims. There's no way this teenager can know more about the law than I do. He's clearly not qualified to enough," the judge said, cutting the prosecutor off sharply. "You've had your say. Now, let the defense speak." The prosecutor opened his mouth to argue again, but the judge's stern gaze silenced him. The courtroom was still, the tension palpable. Everyone knew that the next few moments could change everything. Alex, standing before the court, knew that he had done everything he could. He had presented his case logically and clearly, with no room for doubt. The facts were on his side. And now, it was up to the judge to decide. The judge sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk as he looked at the evidence in front of him. He didn't say anything for what felt like an eternity. The silence in the room was thick, almost suffocating. Alex stood still, his eyes on the judge, waiting for a decision. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "I've reviewed the evidence, and I've listened to both sides. I must admit, I was initially skeptical of the defense, but I can no longer ignore the facts. The prosecution's case is riddled with inconsistencies, and the defense has provided a compelling argument." Alex's heart skipped a beat as he heard the judge's words. The prosecutor, who had been so confident just moments ago, stood frozen, unable to speak. "The defendant is hereby found not guilty," the judge concluded, his gavel coming down with a sharp crack. Alex let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The room erupted into murmurs, and the prosecutor's face turned bright red. But Alex didn't care. He had won. Not just for the defendant, but for himself. He had proven that age didn't matter when it came to truth and justice. As the courtroom began to empty, Alex stood there for a moment, his mind racing. He had done it. Against all odds, he had succeeded. The judge had acknowledged his brilliance, and the prosecutor had been forced to admit that he had underestimated the teenager. For the first time that day, Alex allowed himself a small smile. The fight was over, and he had emerged victorious. As a brief respite, but it didn't last long. Alex sat in his seat, his thoughts racing. His heart was still pounding from the courtroom battle that had just taken place. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom lingering on him, but he didn't allow himself to be distracted. He had made progress, but the next part of the case would be even harder. He knew that he had to stay sharp. The prosecutor wasn't going to back down easily, and the judge would be expecting more. The judge called the court back into session, his voice breaking the tension in the air. As the room settled down, Alex stood once again, his nerves beginning to steady. He had already surprised everyone by pointing out flaws in the prosecution's argument, but now it was time to push harder. He wasn't just defending the defendant anymore, he was defending himself too. He was proving that he had the ability to stand tall in this courtroom and speak the truth. The prosecutor was back in his seat, his face tight with frustration. He had clearly underestimated Alex and now seemed eager to win back some of the control he had lost. The judge took his seat at the bench, his expression unreadable. The courtroom fell silent as the judge gestured for Alex to continue. "Your Honor," Alex began, his voice steady, "I'd like to address the next point in the prosecution's case." He took a deep breath, remembering everything he had studied and reviewed over the last few weeks. "There's another witness who claims they saw the defendant at the scene, but their statement doesn't align with the forensic evidence." Alex's voice was clear and focused as he outlined his next argument. He presented the evidence with precision, pointing to the inconsistencies in the testimony. He wasn't just repeating facts this time. He was breaking down the case piece by piece, showing how each piece of evidence didn't quite fit together. The prosecutor's expression grew darker as Alex spoke. He clearly didn't like being challenged in such a direct way, especially by someone so young. He leaned forward and interrupted Alex with a sharp tone. "This is all speculation, Your Honor. The defense is trying to confuse the issue with irrelevant details." But Alex was ready. He wasn't going to let the prosecutor derail him. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is not speculation. The facts speak for themselves," he said, maintaining his calm. "The statement made by the witness contradicts the physical evidence. And when the witness was cross-examined, they could not provide a consistent timeline." The judge looked at Alex, his eyes narrowing as he processed the argument. The prosecutor scoffed, clearly unwilling to admit that Alex might have a point. "This is nonsense," the prosecutor muttered under his breath, but the judge didn't seem to care. He wasn't quick to dismiss anything anymore. "You're saying the witness was unreliable?" the judge asked, his voice surprisingly serious. Alex nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. The witness's description of events simply doesn't match the physical evidence. And when questioned further, they couldn't provide a clear account of what they saw." The judge leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him. "I see," he said slowly. "Proceed." Alex moved on, his mind already shifting to the next part of his argument. He wasn't going to let this be a simple case of pointing out flaws. He had to show that the entire case was built on shaky ground. With each point, Alex was digging deeper, showing that there was a serious lack of solid evidence. The prosecutor, looking increasingly impatient, stood again. "This is getting out of hand," he said, his voice rising. "The defense is grasping at straws." Alex didn't flinch. He had been prepared for this. "Your Honor, I'm simply pointing out the facts as they are. I'm not the one making things up. The prosecution's case is full of inconsistencies and holes that need to be addressed." The judge's gaze shifted from Alex to the prosecutor. He didn't speak, but the way he looked at the prosecutor made it clear that he was considering what Alex had just said. The prosecutor opened his mouth to argue, but the judge cut him off. "We've heard enough from you for now," the judge said firmly. "Let the defense continue." The prosecutor sat back down, clearly seething with frustration. Alex knew that this was a turning point. He could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him, but he refused to back down. This wasn't just about winning a case. It was about proving that he belonged here, that he wasn't just a teenager who got lucky. He had earned his place, and he would not let anyone take that away from him. As the case continued, Alex's confidence grew. He wasn't just pointing out the flaws in the prosecution's case anymore. He was showing how the entire argument was built on shaky assumptions and incomplete evidence. One by one, he dismantled each claim, offering counter-arguments that made the prosecution's case seem less and less credible. He noticed that the courtroom was growing quieter with each passing moment. The judge was no longer simply listening to him. He was studying the evidence, his mind clearly working through the points that Alex had raised. Even the prosecutor, though clearly upset, was now paying closer attention. There was a tension in the room that hadn't been there before. Alex wasn't just another young defendant, he was a force to be reckoned with. The prosecutor, now clearly rattled, tried to recover by shifting focus. He pointed to one of the pieces of evidence and tried to question its validity. But Alex had anticipated this. Without missing a beat, Alex countered the prosecutor's argument, offering a clear and detailed explanation of why the evidence was reliable. He explained how the forensic data supported the defendant's innocence, how the chain of custody had been maintained, and how the evidence lined up with the timeline. The judge didn't interrupt. He was listening carefully now, no longer dismissing Alex as a naive teenager. It was clear that the judge was taking everything Alex said seriously. The prosecutor, now visibly uncomfortable, attempted to challenge Alex again, but his words lacked the conviction they had held earlier. It was as if Alex's calm, well-thought-out arguments had completely taken the wind out of his sails. The prosecutor had run out of excuses, and everyone in the room could see it. Alex wasn't done yet. There was still one last thing he had to address. He looked at the judge, his eyes steady, and said, "Your Honor, the prosecution has presented this case as though the defendant is guilty from the start. But the facts don't support that. If you examine the evidence objectively, you'll see that there's no way to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed this crime." The judge nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. The prosecutor, who had once been so confident, now seemed unsure of himself. The weight of the moment was heavy in the air, and for the first time in the trial, it was clear that the balance was shifting in Alex's favor. The judge, who had been leaning back in his chair with an almost bored expression, now sat a little straighter. His eyes narrowed as Alex continued speaking. The prosecutor, who had initially mocked Alex's defense, now seemed less confident. His smug demeanor faltered as Alex methodically pointed out details that others had missed, things the prosecutor hadn't prepared for. Alex wasn't just relying on what he had written in his notes. He was bringing something to the table that couldn't be found in a book. He was using his sharp mind, his ability to think on his feet. As he spoke, his voice grew steadier. His stuttering had nearly disappeared, replaced by a quiet confidence that surprised even him. The prosecutor, clearly irritated now, rose to his feet. "Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "with all due respect, the defendant has no business making these claims. He's simply repeating things he's heard from others." His words were like an attack, trying to break Alex's focus. He was trying to make Alex look like an amateur, to take the wind out of his sails. But Alex wasn't fazed. In fact, the challenge only pushed him further. "Objection, Your Honor," Alex said, his voice calm but firm. "The prosecutor is misrepresenting my statements. I'm not repeating anything. I've studied this case in depth, and I can assure you that the discrepancies I've pointed out are valid." The judge looked at Alex for a moment, his expression unreadable. He had heard objections before, but there was something different about this one. For the first time, he wasn't so sure. The prosecutor, caught off guard, cleared his throat and tried again. He knew he had to regain control of the situation. "Your Honor, this is absurd. A teenager cannot possibly understand the complexities of this case," he said, trying to turn the courtroom's attention back to his side. But as he spoke, something began to shift. The judge's earlier skepticism was starting to melt away. "Let him speak," the judge said, surprising everyone in the room. His tone was calm, but there was a new layer of respect in his voice that hadn't been there before. He leaned forward, resting his chin in his hand as he looked at Alex. Alex, heart racing, seized the opportunity. He knew this was his moment. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, taking a deep breath. He gathered his thoughts for a moment before continuing. "If you look at the timeline of events that the prosecution has presented, you'll see that there are gaps. The time of the incident doesn't match the witness statements. According to their own evidence, the defendant couldn't have been where they claim he was. I've gone through every piece of evidence, and it doesn't add up." The prosecutor's face reddened as Alex spoke, but he didn't interrupt. Instead, he was scrambling for a way to challenge Alex's claims. But it was clear that Alex had already done his homework. His argument was not based on guesswork, it was grounded in facts, in evidence that the prosecutor had overlooked. The judge, who had been silent, now looked down at his notes. "I'll admit," he said slowly, "you've made some interesting points, young man." His voice was still measured, but there was no denying the change in his tone. Alex allowed himself a small breath of relief, but he couldn't stop now. He knew that he had to continue, to press the advantage he had created. He kept his eyes on the judge, not letting his nerves get the better of him. "There's another point I'd like to address," he said, looking up from his notes. The prosecutor was starting to look uneasy. He had hoped that Alex would lose his focus, that the teen would make a mistake. But Alex was not backing down. He was speaking as though he had been in this courtroom for years, as if he had the same level of expertise as the seasoned attorneys around him. "I've examined the statements of the key witnesses, and there's a clear inconsistency in what they've said. One witness claims they saw the defendant at the scene, but their description of the time doesn't match the surveillance footage," Alex continued. "That footage is the most critical piece of evidence in this case, and it proves that the defendant couldn't have been at the location at the time the prosecution suggests." The judge furrowed his brow as he looked at the evidence Alex had presented. It was undeniable. Alex wasn't just throwing out words. He was laying out a solid case, and for the first time, the judge was beginning to wonder if the teenager had known more about law than anyone had assumed. The prosecutor, visibly frustrated, stood up again. "This is nothing more than speculation, Your Honor," he said, trying to regain control of the room. "This boy is simply pulling things out of thin air." Alex, however, wasn't intimidated. "I'm not speculating," he said, his voice stronger now. "I've researched every detail. I've looked at every document. And what I'm telling you is the truth." The room was silent for a moment. Even the prosecutor seemed to hesitate before responding. The judge watched closely, his fingers drumming lightly on his desk as he considered everything that had been said. He was starting to see this case in a new light. "All right," the judge said after a long pause, his voice slow and thoughtful. "We'll take a recess. Let me look over the evidence again." As the room began to clear, Alex sat down at the table, his mind racing. He had done it. He had gotten the judge's attention. But the battle wasn't over. He knew that the prosecutor would come back swinging, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. He had to keep proving that he wasn't just some teenager in over his head. He glanced around the room at the faces of the onlookers. Some were still skeptical, but there was a growing respect in their eyes. They hadn't expected this. Alex wasn't just a kid. He was a force to be reckoned with. As the court recessed, Alex leaned back in his chair, a sense of accomplishment flooding over him. But there was no time to relax. The hardest part was yet to come. Alex hesitated for a moment before he spoke. "Yes, Your Honor. I'll be representing myself." The judge smirked, exchanging a look with the prosecutor, who couldn't hide his amusement. "Well, let's see how well you do, then," the judge said, leaning back in his chair, crossing his arms, and waiting for the teenager to make a mistake. Alex took a deep breath, trying to ignore the eyes that were now on him. He glanced down at his notes, which were neatly arranged in front of him, though his hands still shook slightly. He had studied the case for weeks, reading through every document he could find, going over every legal term, and memorizing key arguments. But even though he knew the case backwards and forwards, there was something about being in the courtroom that made everything feel 10 times harder. The prosecutor, a tall man with short, slicked back hair, began his opening statements. He wasted no time in making the case seem clear-cut. The evidence was overwhelming, and there was no reason for the teenager to even try to defend himself. The words were sharp, delivered with confidence. The judge nodded along as the prosecutor went through the case. When it was Alex's turn to speak, he stood up straight and cleared his throat. His voice wavered slightly, but he started to speak. "Your Honor, members of the court," he began, though his words felt heavy, as if they were weighing him down. He glanced over at the prosecutor, who was already looking at him with a mocking smile. Alex continued, "I understand the case. I know the facts, and I'm here to present my side. The prosecution is mistaken on a few points, and I hope to address those today." The judge, who had been leaning back with his arms crossed, sat up a little straighter but didn't say anything. He raised an eyebrow, clearly thinking that Alex wouldn't last long. The prosecutor rolled his eyes as if to say, "Here we go." Alex began explaining his defense. It was simple at first, laying out the facts as best as he could. He stammered a few times, but his determination pushed him forward. As he spoke, he was aware of how nervous he looked, how much younger he seemed compared to everyone else in the room. But as he went on, something strange began to happen. His words started to make sense. The more Alex spoke, the clearer his arguments became. He didn't rely on fancy legal terms. He simply spoke the truth, pointing out facts that the prosecutor had overlooked. He calmly explained discrepancies in the evidence, citing case law and previous rulings he had studied. It wasn't the kind of defense that would come from a seasoned attorney, but it was enough to make people sit up and take notice. The judge, who had initially been so confident in dismissing Alex, started to pay more attention. He even made a mental note of the fact that Alex was bringing up points that weren't in the paperwork, things that no one had expected a teenager to know. Alex's voice grew a little steadier as he continued, but the nerves were still there, bubbling underneath. The judge watched him, unsure if the teenager was simply lucky or if there was something more to him than met the eye. The prosecutor, sensing that things weren't going as smoothly as he had planned, interrupted. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. This boy doesn't even understand the basics of the case," he said, a mocking tone creeping into his voice. Alex remained calm, unflinching. He simply responded, "I understand more than you think." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The judge, who had been expecting this to be an easy win, was starting to feel uneasy. He could see that Alex was presenting arguments, genuine arguments that were challenging the evidence, but he still wasn't ready to admit that this teenager might know what he was talking about. "Is that so?" the judge asked, his voice still skeptical. "Then why don't you explain, in detail, the flaw in the prosecution's argument?" Alex nodded, his palms sweating as he opened his notes. He knew that this was the moment that could make or break him. If he got this wrong, the judge would dismiss him as just another confused teenager. But if he got it right, it could change everything. Taking a deep breath, he began to explain, his voice growing more confident. "If you look at Exhibit A," he said, pointing to a document in front of him, "you'll notice that the timeline the prosecutor has laid out doesn't line up with the witness testimony. The defendant was at the scene, but not at the time stated." Alex paused, making sure he had the judge's attention. "This is a mistake, and it's a key factor in this case." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't convinced yet, but Alex's words were starting to have an effect. As the session continued, the judge began to wonder, could it be that this teenager knew more than he had initially thought? Could he really be making a case that had some merit? The judge shook his head, trying to focus. He had to remember that Alex was just a teenager. But with each passing minute, he couldn't help but feel a slight shift in his thoughts. Perhaps there was more to this young man than the judge had realized.